Thank you both for coming along today. I'm delighted to have you here and to hear your memories of Sundays well. So, Ger, will you get the ball running on your early years in Sundays well?
I started here when I was 14. I took up tennis when I was 13. And I started in St. Michael's Tennis Club. But Dad was always a member here. And so he joined me here then with himself. Well, added on me onto his membership. So I started here when I was 14. When I was 14, children were very much seen and not heard. And so therefore we weren't able to book courts. And we certainly were not allowed to play on court 1, 2 and 3. We had to play on the lower courts. And when we started initially, where would be now court 4 and court 5, those courts were on their own. And then courts 6, 7 and 8 were cordoned off. So it was 3 courts, 2 courts on their own and then 3 courts. The top courts being grass and then the rest of them being tarmac. But they were in the good old days, so that's about 44 years ago. I don't really remember when they changed. I don't know if you remember when the courts changed.
I don't remember that now.
Yeah, but it was...
I was more interested in squash at that particular time.
Yeah, you played a lot of squash, didn't you?
I played a lot of squash. Came from Collins Club, the Collins Barracks Club. Came from the squash. Even though I played tennis in Collins Barracks as well.
How many squash teams would you have had at that stage? Like when you moved over? So you're talking about moving over what year?
And I think I came here in 1974, 75.
Okay, so I would have been about 10. And how many squash teams did they have?
Squash was only in its infancy at that time. I think we had only 1 or 2 squash teams.
And what was the highest that you can remember having here as squash players, squash teams?
We had international squash players here.
Now remember, didn't you have, you used to have friendlies in the squash against Fitzwilliam? You'd have a home and away match.
Oh, we'd have home and away. We went to Northern Ireland, to Belfast as well. And I think we went to Galway. We travelled around, yeah. Squash was beginning to become popular. It's a fabulous game for the players. Not so good for spectators, but it's great for players. So I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah. I mean, our junior program when I joined, it certainly wasn't every day. We came in 1 day a week. I can't remember, did we come in 1 or 2? But Greg was coaching me when I started here when I was 14. And there would have only been the Keens, myself and the Crotties would have been kind of it. We wouldn't really have had anybody else. There certainly wasn't any adult coaching going on that I can remember. Don't remember Greg being active in any part of that, and he was the only coach here at the time. But I do remember, I think he had a little shop here. He had a little shop and he'd kind of sell rackets and stuff like that. And at that stage, the office was out where the reception areas. And you had Liam and Lisa. Remember Liam and Lisa in the downstairs office? And before Liam what was the name of the guy with the white hair? Scott. Wasn't it something Scott?
Stott,
that was it. What was his first name?
Jim?
Jim Stott. Was it Jim Stott? Do you remember him? He was a nice fellow. And then Liam O'Brien took over from him.
Right, yeah.
And Lisa came in very early.
Liam O'Regan.
Liam O'Regan, yeah. And then Lisa came in. Lisa came in then at the start with Liam O'Regan, so she's here a long time. She's probably here about 30 years, I would think, if not more. But changes-wise, you know, it was quite funny. When we started here, the men's changing room was on the ground floor at the bottom, and the ladies had this woeful stairs to go up. It was like Patrick's Hill. And I remember going up there several times and trying to help ladies down. Because it was the only place.
It was a comedy at the time.
Yeah, so the only place you could go to the toilet was upstairs. And people were coming down in heels. Whereas the men had the private place on the ground floor. And then, you were on the bottom and we were on the top. So it changed then. I don't know when it changed. It must have changed in probably the 80s. Was it? It changed? That the men's, or was it at the time of the extension? But I don't think so. Was it the time of the extension that we changed the...
No, it's been changed before that.
I thought it would be changed before that, I would have thought.
Yeah.
And we changed it. But in relation to what was going on in the club, certainly from the way I started, it's totally flipped. So now you have coaching from Monday to Friday for kids. You've adult coaching. In the squash, you have junior coaching and you've adult coaching. I don't ever remember, Dad. I remember you taking me on to teach me squash. And you were going to make me the first.
Very interested.
You were the first. You were going to make me the first player with a double-handed backhand in squash, which never worked. But there wasn't any squash coaching really as such there. And then there was a guy, Nicky Walsh, who came in. He was a Gaeldor.
That's right.
And he started teaching some of our juniors. So he, Quiva Nolan, Carl Nolan's daughter, she would have been one. Mel Houlihan. There were a few of them that kind of started and they did okay and they started playing competition. It was the start of juniors going into the squash because at that stage it had only been adults. There had been no juniors.
Yeah.
So he was the start of really bringing the juniors in on the squash. And to be fair to Greg brought in the juniors and he kind of kept it ticking. And it was over time, it just developed. But I don't know why it got bigger, but I think our own crew, like in those days, you had to be a family member. You couldn't be a junior member within your own right. You had to be a family member. And so kind of Brian Olden, who'd been playing in Highfield, kind of started to come down. And there were players like that who kind of started to come in. But I don't think we ever had more than 12. And I don't think that changed until I started coaching here and restarted coaching here. And I think then, and Greg. And I think that was the change in making the junior program probably a more profitable program for the club and bringing in more juniors. And then I think Nicky Walsh and yourself would have been responsible for the junior squash.
Yes, that's true. Yes, yeah.
Now, what I've heard from the other members is that in fact, squash saved the club.
It did.
It was going rapidly downhill.
That's true at the time. Yes, squash
no
became
tennis being
very
played,
popular.
and squash became popular, and it actually saved.
It did. The club went through a bad time at one stage, but squash kept going.
Yeah.
And thing is reversed now. Tennis is more prominent. And
yeah. Well, then I think
is,
the courts were changed, and there was freer access for women and children. I think it evolved over time.
Yeah.
I definitely think I think that you had people like, I don't know if you remember Anne Hegarty, who played squash here. She lived up here, up beyond where you are, on the corner. She lived in that house at the other side on the corner. And she was a fairly, I don't know if you remember her, Dad. She was a very good player.
Yeah,
and she was fairly bolshy. And so I remember being here and women were not allowed inside the snooker room at all. And there was some match on. There was a friendly internal match, but there was a match on. And I remember her grabbing me by the arm. And I couldn't have been any more than 16 or 17. And we'd been after an internal or a league match, a Munster league match. And she pulled me in and she said, come on, we're going in here. And I can't remember who was playing snooker. But she straddled the table. And she put a leg on either side and said, now pop that, boys. And I remember sitting there going, wow. This, so she really, and the men were like, they didn't know whether to laugh or they didn't know whether to tell her get out. And she was kind of the one who started to get women to come in a little bit more. She really was a very strong woman and really wasn't willing to sit back and let men kind of dictate what was going on. And so for me, as a kid growing up, she would have been, for me, the big changing point. She was the one who stands out where she had the guts to stand up to the guys and say, I'm not willing to stand for this. And in the squash, we always had, we had a good women's team. We had myself, Margaret Donovan, Curtin, Mary Curtin, Kearney. We had Mary Curtin, Mary Daunt, and myself. So we had a really good squash team, and we used to travel and we'd play in the Munster leagues and stuff. And then the men, I only remember one or two teams at that stage, but I was probably about 16, 17. And I think you still only had maybe one or two men's teams at that stage.
That's about it, yes, yeah. Des Campbell became a very good squash player. Val Dorgan from the examiner office, he was a very good squash player. And we travelled a lot because squash got very popular. And it kept the club going, as you rightly say. At the time, things went downhill, and that is reversed now, of course. Yes.
And you know, when you say that they went downhill, does that mean that there wasn't enough income coming in from tennis, but there was more income coming in from squash?
And more players as well. Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
And the club itself had become quite run down. It was, I mean, you could only play in the summertime. There were no
Yeah.
lights,
Yeah,
so
that's true.
very limited
Very
hours
limited.
of play.
That's right. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I think originally the Sun as well was an all male, and then it's changed over the years. And now it's obviously it's a equal status for men and women, which is marvelous. And it's a fabulous club for that. Yeah, that. Yeah, and there's a good camaraderie between the squash and the tennis, which is important.
And I think women are becoming, they're starting in the last few years, they're taking more senior roles in the club.
Oh, they are.
They
of course,
probably
yes.
would have been in small, but I think, with Mary Jane and Alice and Valerie kind of leading the way, I think we kind of became, the women started to come in a little bit more. And
Yes, yeah.
but I mean, I know that when I joined us at the age of 18, I was only a lady associate, and I was only a lady associate certainly until I started coaching here. Because I remember I could have kept on my lady associate, and the fact that I was working here, I went, no, I wanted to have equal rights. So therefore, I moved over to a full member. But that's only, I don't know the year, but
94, I think.
I'd say that'd be, yeah, and I would have said even later, because 94 would have made me, that'd be about right, would have made me almost 30,
Jane
yeah.
became captain, I think, in 98 or 99.
Who did?
Mary Jane.
Okay, yeah.
And she was the first lady captain.
Yeah. And I do think that kind of changed things around. And then, as you said, then with people becoming more equal, then the club expanded.
Yeah. That's true, yeah.
We weren't tucked in the kitchen.
That was the main female role up to then, wasn't
yeah.
it? Preparing food.
Yeah.
Preparing food and just being seen to be around and to clean up. But I think then things started to change and become more equal. And now I would think it's very much 50-50.
Very much 50-50, yes, yeah.
And I think the club, but one of the things I like about this club, I've travelled with Irish teams, I've travelled all over Europe. And you might find a club that has better facilities, more courts, indoor courts. But actually this club is a club that, as it was built and as it expanded, it never lost its soul. This club has a soul. And if you came in here during COVID, it was a very sad club to come into. It was sad. I mean, I didn't like coming in, Dave was working here and I'd come in to do a few jobs or whatever, but it lost that. And so when now it needs the people, and it needs the people around to kind of keep that buzz and so it's as if the soul that's inside in the club, if the people aren't around and the community isn't around, it just dies.
And the interesting thing for this club is that it's active from 8 o'clock in the morning until 10 or 11 o'clock at night.
That's the beauty about
You
it,
have-
yes, it is.
Between adults and juniors, there are people
Very
here
active,
all the time.
Yes, yeah, very active.
And it is, I mean, it's one of those that you see different parts. Like I remember the extension going on, and I remember the expanding the car park and all that, but you could still walk in that front door and you still get the soul. And I think that's phenomenal. And I don't get that in any other club anywhere in Europe that I've been into. As I said, they might have better facilities, but you walk in and you feel it's commercial. But this place is, and I think the committees here and I think the club itself have worked very hard, and I'm sure you've heard me say this before, I think it's worked very hard at becoming a community, because where other clubs have residential areas, this club has members that are all over the place. They're country members, you've country members, you've people who might live in Mallow, or you might have people who live in Monkstown. If you go into Ballinlough or into Bishopstown or to any of the others, you'll probably find they live within a 5-mile radius. And so therefore everything happens around it. There's kids go to school around it and everything's within that small community.
Yeah, yeah.
This club never had that. And so when I started here and I'd come to coaching, I had the Keens from Claheen, I had the Crotties from Sundays Well, and I came the furthest. I came the furthest from Blackrock. And so it really was, it didn't have that real homely feel. And I think it started to improve with the juniors the year Mark Collins and Audrey Spillane were both about 14, 15, and there was a group of them. And they would come up here. Audrey obviously didn't have to travel far, but Mark did. And they would come up here and they'd play tennis, and then there'd be a group of them would go into the park for a walk, and then they'd come back and they'd play tennis, and they would hang. Because at that stage, kids were allowed to do that. And they would start to hang. And that was the start of a really, really good foundation for keeping that going. And then I think we built on that. And I think the club have done exceptionally well at making this a community. Like you come here now, you've seen it at a Winter League match. And you see them coming up just to see who's playing, to support each other, you know.
And I think making the juniors welcome here was a big step forward.
Big step. Yeah, big step. And that, I can tell you, that took a long time. I don't know how many times as coaches here we had to stand our ground where we had dinosaurs telling us that the kids, you know, were talking, and what were they doing talking, and you know that they're not meant to talk. And then there was a time where, you know, you might find a child, courts are free on court 1, 2 and 3, and a kid goes on to court to play with another child, and somebody would come down and kick them off, even though they didn't want it, but they didn't want the children up on court 1, 2 and 3. So kind of that took a long time to get over. But I think we did. I think we've got over it. I think this is a very progressive club.
It has evolved, you know, from the old style clubs,
and it evolved,
which were male dominated generally. It has evolved. It's now a very equal club.
It took time. It was very slow in the beginning, but it has picked up in latter years.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so. And I think the women who've come in positions like captain or chairperson, I think have been very good characters to put forward, because, you know, they have that nice way of dealing. They're very polite and they have the right way, and they only want equality. They're not looking to prove a point. And I think they have been very supportive of the club. I think they've been very good people. You know?
The junior committees over in recent years as well have been very proactive.
And the coaching, I think the introduction of the coaching review committee has been very important. I think the junior committee is still, like the junior committee, when you look at the Santa party here, you used to come to it with here.
Young years, that's right, yes, yeah.
Like that was the start, and now it's a much bigger event. But that's thanks to the junior committee. It's thanks to Fiona O'Keefe, Cara Nagel, Ciara Fry, you know, and the group that they have. They're phenomenal. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the Santa inside. It is just, it's better than, and I've had people tell me it's better than photo. It's just, they put in a huge amount of work, and it's putting the right people into what their skill set is and being able to use that. But I think the junior committee have come on, and I've had people from Dublin. We run this a 2-day event. We only started it last year in June. This year it's the 7th and 9th of June. And I got letters, I got emails from parents who'd come down from Dublin, because the junior committee went to the trouble of getting a breakfast here on the Sunday. They made out a breakfast, so the kids could come in. They were getting scones, they were getting fresh fruit, they were getting muesli. They'd never get that in another club. And so the junior committee here, I think, in relation to that, has been very important. And I think they've done, I don't ever remember a junior committee when I was a kid. I don't think there was one.
There was no need for one.
No, there wasn't one. And there was never any, I don't remember, like, was there a squash committee?
Well, there was a squash committee, yes, yeah, and it worked very well, because we got a lot of squash players, you know, who were just starting the game. After Collins, there was nothing in Cork, and then they opened the Orchard, and then things got Highfield and Sun as well, so it became a big sport. And the beauty about Sun as well is that you got no dominant individuals or groups. So it was always a very equal status club for everybody. Nobody was too dominant, which is marvellous, because when you get a dominant people in a club, it sort of reduces its pleasantness if you get a group who begin to dominate. And I always found about Sundays as well that there was nobody ever too dominant, and that, I'd say, contributed to its progress.
Thank you for saying that, Sean.
Did you ever find out that might have been because you had an employed secretary manager versus in other clubs they're voluntary, whereas here you had a secretary manager that was there every year and so was able to keep that consistent? Do you think that helped?
I thought that did help, yes. It gave it a structure,
Yeah.
so that nobody got too close, so the manager had great power. And then the bar people were very good, and there was a great relationship between the bar people and the members. And that's what my memory of it was, as a very happy club. And I say that contributed to it as well.
Did you make any big changes while you were in as chairman?
I'd love to say I did, but
But
I
you can't
can't.
remember. There must have been some changes back from then that kind of started to come in, because I grew up in a house where it was unusual to have equality. You know, I had friends who were always amazed that if my mother made the dinner, the rest of us did the clean up. Like, you and Mum were always very equal, and back in those days it wasn't that norm.
I don't.
Yeah, you're not going to argue that one. But it was unusual, because I knew it from friends of mine.
Yeah.
And so it was always very equal. There was no such thing as Dave did the bins because he was the man and I had to do the ironing because I was a woman. Everything was, Dave, you do the bins this week and next week you're doing the ironing, and vice versa. So I grew up in a household where things were very 50-50. So I'm sure when you came in, you must have brought that in with you. There's no way.
I can't comment on that.
But there's no way
that
he could have been one way.
Yeah, so he was probably instrumental in pushing the club forward in terms of gender equality.
Yeah. I remember you certainly got some award that year. I remember you going to Dublin for some award ceremony, but I can't remember what it was for.
I can't remember myself, but I remember, yeah, I did get something, yes, that's true.
From
yes.
Tennis Ireland.
There was some award from Tennis Ireland, it was kind of like equivalent to what they give out now, which is the gold stars, or what, you know, the gold standard and all of those. But it wasn't quite called that. It had another name, but we did achieve it. And I remember at the time you were chairman, so I remember you leaving me at home and having a party. So I do know you went, but I don't know what it was for. And I don't
I've forgotten myself.
Yeah, we should find out.
Yeah. There was something. So Dad, I think, was here, and I always wanted to play here. And Dad would say, no, you can't. And then I used to play in St. Michael's, where I started playing. And unfortunately, one of my friends got caught smoking. And so her mother rang my father to tell her that, because the friend said, oh, I got it from Ger Flynn, which she hadn't. But so Dad confronted me and said, do you smoke? And I kind of went, well, you know. And he said, well, you have a choice. I'll either join you to Sunday as well, or I'll pay for your cigarettes. Which is it? And I went, oh no, join me to Sunday as well. And that was it. And that was how I started playing up here. And that was it. And there were many a day.
And you never smoked again?
No, never smoked again. But there'd be many a day we'd come up here, and Dad has a knack of, when he's playing tennis with you, he'd say, oh, I'm going to hammer you out today. And he'd be rising, and he'd be going on and on. And then one day I gave him we had a bit of an argument. And next thing I looked and he was gone. And he left me to walk home. So I had to walk from here to Blackrock. And when I got home, he said, it took me about an hour. And by the time I got home, he said, so you won't do that again, will you? And I went, no, won't do that again. That was it. And that was the end of me losing my rag. I don't think I ever lost my temper after that. I think that was it. He said, I'm not putting up with that behaviour. It's not okay. And so he let me walk home. And then we used to play squash until I beat him one day, and I decided
And
I was never.
that.
And I said never playing him again. That was it. I now have my victory, and it's the same in tennis, I'd say.
It started in tennis, yes.
And
The day you beat me in tennis, I stopped playing tennis.
Yeah, and then the same in squash. That was it once we got it. But yeah, they were the good old days, you know. And there weren't that many people here. There certainly were. I mean, certainly growing up, you'd Alice McCarthy was one of the main people here. You'd Anne Phelan. I remember kind of around, but there weren't too many dominant women or women that were here frequently. They might pop up for a game, but Alice used to take me out once a week on a Saturday, and she would play me once a week. And then I played a little bit with Ursula Hegarty, Mary Hegarty's daughter. Ursula was playing here, so she was just a few years older than me, and she would play with me a little bit. But and you had Frances O'Neill with the O'Neills, and then there really wasn't too many more that I would have met here on a regular basis. You know, didn't have, and I suppose, as we said then, that's when the junior things started to pick up.
Yeah, I believe at one stage Jim O'Neill and Mary Kerwin used to do some, it wasn't coaching, but they take the juniors out on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, they would take us out and just hit with us. Yeah. Mary, certainly.
You had the Delaney sisters, they were
That was
very
it,
good.
that's Mary, yeah.
Yeah.
Mary, Sheila and Anne, isn't it? They the three?
Yeah.
And they would, but Mary was the main drive there. Mary would have been, like Jim was working, so he'd come when he could, but Mary certainly was a fine player, and at that stage she was playing, you know, good tennis. And then you had Anthony O'Donoghue would, even though they were Rushbrook, she'd come up to play. Anthony and Red would kind of appear in odd time. And you Daphne and Ronnie Daunt. They would have been huge. And then you had, what was Ronnie Daunt's brother called? Very friendly with Barry Crenan. Remember him? He died a good few years ago. Mary Daunt's husband.
I remember him, yes, but I can't remember his name. Yeah.
And they'd keep you entertained up here. Barry and himself, they'd be out there and they were hilarious. Barry Crenan was probably the most welcoming person in this club. He would walk up to you, and he was a character.
Barry was a character, yeah.
He's a real character. Yeah. And he would go out of his way to have a story or to have a bit of banter about something. Didn't matter who you were.
Yeah.
He was a great character. You know? And then you had people like Niall Coffey. He was huge in relation to the junior. He was the one, you know, in the good old days when we'd do the junior open on paper, he'd spend hours here putting everything down on paper and doing the draws and making sure. So he got very involved, and he got very involved in Munster tennis. And through his involvement with Munster tennis, I think then, you know, and he was very friendly with Greg. And so they then started to, I would probably say they were the people who kind of pulled in and developed it a little bit more. You know, and Niall then went on he was on the board of, well, not the board, but he was on committees in Tennis Ireland, and he'd go up and he'd attend meetings, and then he'd bring all that information back. And that was kind of the start of, and even though he denies it, I remember my story with Niall was, he would have been a Munster selector, and he was outside behind Court 1, and we still have the same picket fence that we had then. And I remember standing there in my skirt and t-shirt, having lost to Claire Cavan in a final. And he turned to me, I was about 14, and he turned to me and he said to me, "You have every shot in the book. It's a pity you don't have a brain." That's what he said to me. And I still remind him. I just didn't. He was right. I didn't have the tennis brain at the time. At 14, I'd only taken it up a year beforehand. I had the shots, but I didn't have the strategy. And it wasn't something, because we didn't play enough tennis. Like in those days, I played squash in the winter here and into pro level, and then I played tennis in the summer. So you didn't have it all year round. So you didn't have the time to develop a strategy. And so unless you had played it from a younger age, so where many might say I still haven't got a strategy, it certainly improved. But he was right. We didn't have the knowledge how to use the strokes that I had. And then he improved that. And you say that about my squash too. You say I didn't have a backhand.
Yes, that's true.
You know, so it was good. Yeah.
Over the years, yes, and now it's obviously equal status for men and women, which is marvellous.
We weren't tucked in the kitchen.
That was the main.
Did you make any big changes while you were in as chairman?
I'd love to say I did, but
But
I
you can't
can't.
remember.